The fires of war. Ishbaal rocketed forward and found himself in a lightning-fast exchange with the Shiver, before being sent nearly 20 yards back with a single swing. His sword was now heavily damaged, almost cleaved in half. Maluk chuckled, figuring the injury of the sword should translate to some injury of the spirit. Both warriors sunk into the weight of their engagement and prepared for the next action. They froze there, the action of the field seeming to blur and become foreign outside their sphere of influence. Pretty field, no place for such carnage. Ishbaal reflected on his thoughts as they had arrived on the battlefield. Now, he couldn't find the time to truly care how pretty the flowers were or what they ruined to wage this war. He was focusing himself on the fight ahead of him right now. The enemy general, Maluk, stood there, stalking him on the field and awaiting his next move. From the corner of his vision, Ishbaal saw the deep gash into his sword that Maluk greeted him with. Fear tried to find its way into his heart, starting with a shaking that was hastily quelled in his hands. He steeled himself, flipping the sword around to its undamaged side and turning it in violent circles before charging into the fight. Other Shiver, watching his march into the fray, wanted his head as their trophy. The smell of his ether filled their nostrils and excited them to a battle frenzy. A curtain of zombies lunged at him, swinging their blades and whips and daggers as they each sought glory. Ishbaal vanquished them with a whirling breeze of sharp steel, never even facing them, keeping his eyes focused on the prize of the battle. He was well past his tremors of fear. He was hypnotized now, and his fangs were hungry for a fresh kill. He glared at the Shiver general through a fence of freshly slain soldiers. His smile caught the glare from the now setting sun and dyed his violent eyes crimson. Maluk stepped forward. From the surrounding fields, Ishbaal was mused by his captains, Shema and Abishai. They marveled at his spirit and the menacing aura he presented. They'd had their hands tied with the unending hordes and only caught glimpses of the exchange between their own efforts to keep themselves alive. They maneuvered closer, seeking their chance to study his assault more closely or jump into the fight if need be. Maluk, getting closer to the general, began to furrow his brow and focus more intently on Ishbaal. His hand raised and directed more of his soldiers to attack the warrior, testing his resolve further. Walls of Shiver lunged at him again, roaring into the twilight air as they became enraged and battle-hungry. The damaged sword was used again, mowing Shiver from his path like rain-starved grasses. The last of the charge, a Shiver who got too close, was pulled in and viciously hacked into a bleeding mess. Again, Ishbaal glared into the eyes of the Shiver general and smiled. Maluk swallowed hard. He had suddenly begun to find the battle-crazed sentinel to be worthy of his attention. His heavy, curved blade was ready and swung, mowing down a line of his own forces that stood between him and the rabid warrior. He engaged him, exchanging lightning-fast slashes and steps that created a storm of sparks. Weaker Shiver again hurried and bombarded Ishbaal. They were allowed this time into the fray by Maluk as he stepped back again to study his opponent. Ishbaal slipped on a discarded piece of armor, falling to a knee. A Shiver hurried and tried to seize his head, but his strike was blocked by the general's blade and cleaved in half. Ishbaal sprang to his feet, weaving violent arcs that shattered skulls and hopes. From a distance, Maluk laughed. He himself began to muse on the warrior's efforts. Although he'd seen this before. Warriors, far too numerous to recall by name, believing their fight was not in vain. They each hacked and cleaved at Shiver soldiers who never mattered. Their armies were frankly made of too many pawns. Maluk had always felt the game board to be far too crowded anyway. These rebellious fools never understood they'd eventually fall to the weight of madness and the Shiver Horde. They would replace the soldiers they killed. Their families, their children, and animals would all become scions of chaos and consumption. Maluk sank his weapon into the ground, propping himself up as he watched the general turn the air around him into a blender. At least he was entertaining to watch. Ishbaal marched forward again, chanting insults at the Shiver General, seeking to incite him to actually participate in combat, to put himself at risk for injury and death, instead of killing waves of zombies that didn't matter. He thought the warrior's efforts amusing. He'd felt as if he'd seen this type of man before. Owed to him were the ways of desperation and hopelessness that made weak men hunger to battle. Maluk was not fazed. Abishai and Shema, coming out of the overwhelming numbers and seeing clearly that the enemy would keep toying with their commander, dove through the lines and formed terrifying walls of wind and fire that reached towards the sky and divided the incursion so that Ishbaal could make his march directly into the fray, directly into the arena against Israel and Maluk. The two of them stood there for a moment, taking in the nature of the being standing no more than 15 feet from themselves. Maluk made the first move, swinging his mighty blade, hoping to cleave his enemy's head in the first try. His blade was halted and parried by Ishbaal, and he returned the strike, aiming like calculated lightning at Maluk's neck. His blade was also stopped short of its target by a timely parry. This was the cadence of their fight. Lightning fast, and directed only at the most vital points. Ishbaal knew that he could not afford to deal glancing blows. His steel needed to strike vital blood and be bathed thoroughly. Sparks kicked up and whipped in flurried circles that caused the grasses and dusty scraps of armor to blaze and ignited the proper flames of war at their feet. To Ishbaal's back, he heard and noticed the fights of his fellows. The singing of wind and flame hissed at his ears and gave him confirmation to the lofty sense of safety his men possessed. They constantly fought in his shadow, compared to his greatness and determination. He tried to set the tone for them, so they may in turn set the tone for the rest of their men. But even under his exterior, he cared and valued their safety. Harder he pushed himself, seeking desperately to outpace the mighty Shiver. He knew this fight had the ability to quell the entire war, to snuff the fires of conflict in a single battle. He couldn't afford to allow this Shiver his life another day. Ishbaal's feet stepped firmly into the smoldering mud, anchoring him deeper into his stance and providing him strength to counter and parry his opponent's strong blows. The clamoring of blades and grunts, ruffling of armor, and yells of exasperation that came from each killing blow, barely missing its mark. Ishbaal, feeling the wind and hearing the springing of rapid steps from his side, sought now not to kill Maluk with his next attack, but to arrest his weapon, and open an opportunity for Shema to attack with a flurry of buzzing spear strikes that sought weak points in the Shiver's armor. Maluk became angry, no longer being entertained by their efforts to survive. He forced Ishbaal back, throwing him into the mud and grass. He then grabbed the spear and pulled Shema in, before slamming him to the ground and stomping him, pressing his foot into the warrior's chest. Abishai saw this and spewed forth a path of flame from his spear that charred Maluk's chest plate and filled his nostrils with smoke and ash. Another attack was wound up in Abishai's hands and thrown before meeting Maluk's furious rebuke, a mighty yell that forced Ether to shield him on all sides. He again stomped Shema, this time in the leg, preventing him from getting to his feet. It was then, with rage welling up in his eyes and chest, that Maluk glared down at Shema and plunged his blade down into the warrior's stomach. His voice sprang up from his throat, bloodied and agonizing. Ishbaal, forgetting his own injuries and pains, leapt up and charged the Shiver. His blade was readied and pointed directly at Maluk, hungry for vengeance. Savagely he swung, heavy blade strokes falling and narrowly missing their mark. Abishai joined his brothers, his spear forming sharp arcs that threatened to decapitate and maim. Maluk stepped forward, past the angry spear's blade, and allowed the shaft to strike him, halting the assault. He kicked Abishai and sent him flying into the mud. Ishbaal continued to press the attack and met Maluk's blade, forcing his own to snap. A mighty boom rang out over the field. Maluk, as he thrust his blade into the belly of the warrior, looked to the horizon to see a wide pair of wings propelling a savage angel towards him. He slung the body to the ground, readying himself for the angel's impact. Missiles of blistering light were launched at Maluk from the angelic host. He used his vast amounts of ether to form a spherical shield that protected him from most of the damage. Craters in the surrounding field painted a cautionary tale of being directly stricken by the angel's attacks. Michael whipped around in the air, swooping down over the cover of ether fire and arrows. He scooped Ishbaal up and sat him next to Abishai, who tended him as Michael studied Maluk. "Shield him," directed the angel as his wings were raised and his body prepared to release a store of ether. He beat them down, hard against the air and the earth, creating a shockwave that followed along the ground and sent Shemah's body tumbling through the ravaged flowers as Maluk braced himself. Other Gibram came to his aid, pulling the near-dead warrior from the conflict, forming a barrier of soldiers around him. "We need our channeler to focus," critiqued Michael. "His own weakness has dulled us."